Hello everyone, thank you for attending the Standards Assurance Show and Tell. We're doing a lot of exciting stuff currently. Today we're going to be talking to you about two things. First thing is the exciting work on the Alpha for Service Assessment Transformation. The second bit is the transformation work we're doing with controls. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to our user researcher, Chris Marshall.
Thanks, Chad. Okay, so yeah, those who don't know me, I'm Chris. I'm a user researcher. I've been working with the on the service assessment transformation program probably for best part of 3 months now, and we moved into Alpha probably just over a month ago. We've been out doing user research, testing the Alpha, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of overview about what we've learned so far. We're still in field, but there's some things that we're learning. So I'll just give you a quick overview of the approach and just a bit of a reminder about what we're doing on the Alpha. We're trialling a new model of service assessment, and we're trialling it with 4 service teams. They're all different, they're all around the country, and they're all at different stages of development. Just as a very quick overview of what the new model is. We're trialling a model of continuous assessment. This is where we get out of our building, we go and visit the service teams where they work in their location, and just try and understand the work that they're doing and kind of how they're working towards meeting the service standard. So the model is, for each team, there is 1 assessor assigned. There are 3 visits in our model that we're trying for Alpha, each with about 2 weeks between each visit. And each visit lasts approximately an hour. And following the first visit, once the assessors met with the service team and they get some understanding of the work that they're doing and the needs of the team, they identify a series of experts to bring along and think about the current model, where we have a live assessment. There's maybe 4 or 5 people in the room for that assessment. This could be a designer, it could be a user researcher, technical arc. And the assessor will identify who they think the team would benefit from meeting with for the second and third visit. We help source them, and then they go along and accompany the assessor to meet the team. So as it goes along, the assessor is providing feedback and recommendations during the meetings themselves, and also by filling out this sort of spreadsheet we have, which has each point of the standard, just some feedback on based on what they've heard and what they've seen, how the team are doing to meet the service standard, and also recommendations, things to think about for the next visit and beyond. And that is made visible to the service team. So assessors, we've got a couple from GDS, both previously been involved as lead assessors. We have someone from NHS Digital who, although knows the service standard really well, they've never actually been in a service assessment or done a service assessment before. And we've also got someone from the Skills Funding Agency who's been through multiple service assessments. So we've got a range of people doing that assessor role. We're not quite sure what the assessor role will be, but by having people with different attributes, we can just basically test it out. And we're not even sure if it's going to be called an assessor, but that's what we've settled with for the Alpha. And just to give you a bit of an overview of my research approach for this, as we're testing a model, the best thing to do is kind of research that backs off really. So I'm shadowing each of the 1-hour face-to-face meetings, essentially taking a lot of notes, looking at how sort of rapport in the room, where they take place, all those sort of things. So that's the observational research. After the second visit, I'm starting to book in interviews with members of the service team, assessors, and also the experts that have attended. And this is to start getting their feedback on the new model, what's working, what's not working, ways it can be improved. Also going to be doing a series of retrospective workshops. And I think this is following, as a separate thing from the one-to-one interviews, this is to get all those who are involved in testing our house together in the same place, and basically again do a group review where people can collaboratively kind of bounce ideas off each other on what worked, again, what didn't work. All of this is contributing to the insight that we're generating on the project. So I'll give you a sense of some of the findings coming out. So far we've finished all the first visits, so we've had 4 visit ones with each service team. We have had the second visit with one of the service teams, but I'm just going to talk to you about what I've observed from visit 1 at the moment. So for me, what I've observed, visit 1 is a bit like the first exchanges of an assessment. It's not so much a thing is shown up front, but it's about establishing context. It's about the kind of terminology. It's about understanding the setting in which the team are operating in. It's an opportunity, if you like, for the service team to kind of like naturally tell their story. I think this is something that happens early on in the current live service assessments, and the assessors are coming into this fairly cold. We're deliberately not giving them lots of background about previous assessments. And we want to know really in that hour, in that first visit, what they can find out about that service team, how they're doing, the nature of their work. So they're very open to being shown things by the team. It's up to the assessor and the service team to come to an arrangement about what they talk about, what's shown. And I think this kind of thing naturally lends the service team to want to tell their story about the work they've done and their rationale. I think the assessors have to give them time to do that as well. It helps them to get to grips with like the language, the terminology, the complexities of the services as well. There's a lot for the assessors to understand. It's hard enough just sitting there taking notes. The amount of acronyms that are thrown at an assessor in the first 10 minutes is a lot for them to get their head around. So they're very much just listening in the first part of the visit. And they really need to do that so they can internalise what they hear. And throughout, it's not so much they're questioning in the first part of the first visit, it's very much that they're almost asking questions to make sure that they've got the right understanding, that whether it be terminology, whether it be figures, whether it be target user groups, whatever, they're clarifying at that point. But from what I can see, it's when things start being shown to the assessors, that's when they can really start getting their teeth into the service and they can see what's going on. And by that, I saw examples of, if it's a BEAST service, stuff that's on gov.uk, user journey maps, the as-is and the envisioned service were often shown. Prototypes, prioritisation diagrams, planning boards, across the 4 service teams, these all came out. It was very much probably about the halfway stage of the first visit that stuff started to get shown to the assessors. And I think this had an impact as well on what was kind of discussed at these initial visits. So user research came up very quickly. I think it was a way in for assessors to get an understanding of the project. It's what is one of the first things that's talked about in the current service assessment model. So user research across all of them was covered at some point, and it took quite a lot of depth for the first visit. I think data and existing processes also came up, particularly where there was an existing live service. It's kind of like that secondary evidence. That was also surfaced, and there's quite a bit of discussion around that. There was also a lot of talk around assisted digital across, I think, every one of the meetings this came up. It's still an issue that's a challenge for service teams, and also a fair bit of chat around accessibility. I think it's fair to say, again, from the first visits, design, content and tech, they came up, but only in passing. And I think it was around the halfway point of the first visit that assessors had heard enough, they'd start internalising, and they could start getting into what was actually going on and start asking questions. And this is, I think it was really interesting because I didn't expect this to happen in these first visits. But we've observed an assessor sort of raising a point with a service team that they hadn't considered before. And that's really great because fairly early on they've developed enough rapport with the team that they're confident enough to say, well, have you thought about this? And the team's reaction was really great, actually. It wasn't so much, no, we haven't thought about that. It was very much, this is a really good point. And they were really grateful that it had been raised. I think it was also obvious that the service teams were more relaxed in their own space. Within the current model, they're invited into GDS Towers, they sit for a 4-hour assessment in our boardroom, and it's very much an exam kind of scenario where you're grilled by a panel of people, most likely you haven't met before. It's very different when you've got an assessor in the room having a conversation with the team, even with some observers in there tapping away. We felt they were very open about, what their challenges were on the service. It was interesting to see the dynamic that it was in a range of environments as well that this first visit took place. So I think for me, the most relaxed environment was in the middle of the office, where they had a kind of collaborative space with a screen, a bench either side. You had the assessor kind of in the middle, and he was surrounded by sort of 5-6 people within that service team, all different roles. And conversation was just flowing around the table, all very natural. They covered loads in the hour, and it was very much a discussion, which we often say our service assessments are. But it's a very different discussion then, if we call what we do at the moment a discussion. So it was very different also when they were in their own. If we went into a fairly small room, I noticed that, again, it felt that almost like barriers were slightly put up. It was very odd. There were other reasons why there was barriers put up, but I did notice that the actual location had a big impact on how that first visit went. I think the conversations were really constructive. They were not adversarial. But it was difficult for assessors to make a judgment on how the team were doing after the first visit. Going back to what I said at the start, it's about developing context, it's about understanding, it's about getting into a conversation with that service team. It's very hard to think, right, 18 points to the standard, how is this team doing against each one of those points? But the assessors did have a go, and for the most part they could feed back on quite a number of those standards just on that first hour visit. And they could also make recommendations too. It also meant that just based on 1 hour, they had quite a clear view on who to bring along to the next visit in terms of the experts, but also what the discussion focus should be for the second visit. One more kind of big thing from the first visits, I think this is quite a key thing for me. So if it's a senior decision maker is in that initial visit, it really has an impact on the nature of that conversation. I think it's not the open kind of chat. It's very much a chat because my boss is in the room, so I'm going to be much more guarded on what I'm going to say. It's a fairly natural thing, I think. And also, we saw a tendency that the senior decision maker would try and own the conversation and the narrative with the assessor. So yeah, service teams are more open when that person's not present. And I think the most constructive visit did involve more people. So range of skills in that service team were reflected in that room. All of them were involved, all contributing. It was great to see my last visit, there was a user researcher around the table, but everyone around the table brought back something from the kind of guerrilla user research they were doing, which was quite an innovative approach, involving recruitment using their call centre and data centre people. Everyone had a story that they could bring to the table from that, and that was great to see. So there was no dominant voice in that conversation. I think that is the main thing from what I picked up from these first visits. If everyone is empowered in that team and they all feel they're in a space where they can talk about their work, they're going to share more. And I think that's something we're going to look out for to see if that dynamic changes at the second and third visit. And we're hoping it's going to continue because I think based on 1 hour we learned an awful lot about these teams and the work they're doing. So yeah, that's it from visit 1. We've started the second lot of visits. Timings wise, we'll have completed all 3 visits across the 4 service teams this side of Christmas, and we're doing ongoing analysis on what we're learning, all being fed back into the team. Any questions?
How did the assessors feel about the process? It wasn't out long now. How it feels really short.
It's a good question. I don't know till I interview them. So I've had anecdotal feedback. I think it's been clear where the first visits have gone well and they've been really open, and the service team been really clear with the assessors. They've learned an awful lot. I think it's all about the focus as well. One service we visited, we didn't really get into the detail of what that team were doing until really towards the end. It was very much again, the senior decision maker trying to paint the landscape of what the department are doing. But really, I mean, that is too big for this thing that we're doing here, where we're trying to understand the specific work of the service team. So I think focus and how that first meeting's positioned is really important.
Okay. Can I pass the mic to you because we have people listening? Yeah. Live stream. Okay. Thanks a lot. That was really interesting. Just following up on that question, two quick questions. One is, how do you come up with an hour? How do you decide that time?
It's quite an arbitrary length of time, but it's really thinking about the current model. We have a 4-hour assessment, and some of this is saying, well, if you were to almost like split that 4-hour up into chunks, how much could you learn by visiting that team on a regular basis for a relatively small amount of time? Some of it is linked to our thinking around costs, because if we're going to have a continuous model, there are cost implications. I think it's fair to say for the Alpha that a lot of the resourcing side of things, where we're not looking at in real detail at the moment. What we're trying to see at the moment is the essence of this model of like continuous visiting, seeing how that plays out and stuff like this, and we're learning.
And the other question was, when is that first assessment? And sorry if you've already said this, like a bit late.
So when is the first visit? Is that
in relation to what? I mean, you just.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. So I think we will say that this would start at the beginning of a phase. So that's not a hard and fast rule for these teams, because some of these teams have been in their phase for a period of time. But ideally, I mean, taking this to its full conclusion, there potentially wouldn't be a service assessment, but it would just be that after a series of visits, the team have reached a level of maturity and they've demonstrated they've met all the points in the standard to progress to the next phase. So there wouldn't be, this would almost continue indefinitely until that service is complete. Now, whether it would stay at 2 weeks is the amount of time between the visits, whether it all would happen like in person, they're all things that I think we're going to experiment more with. But the idea is it's a continuous conversation with that team, as opposed to a series of gated events, if you like.
I don't know if everyone can hear on that microphone, so Chris, if you can answer the question.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Two things, of course, because we're all shafted. The first one is, were they services at alpha or beta or a mixture, and were there any differences between those? Because the flexible thing intuitively feels like it's probably more useful for an alpha than it is necessarily for a beta, where we're turning on access to the internet. Don't know if there's anything you've got as to whether or not that's true or not.
Based on the initial visits, the priorities of the teams did vary. I think Discovery and Alpha teams, it was much more around user research and what they've done by the way of prototyping and things like that. I think the live service, it was very much, because they've been through a series of service assessments, there were things that had highlighted in previous assessments that were high on their list of priorities. So we had quite a lot of chat around AD, and even though the teams coming up to live, they're essentially still needed support in that area. So that was their focus.
And the second question was, I mean, we all do this a lot. We're all good critics. We can always find things that people could have been doing differently. Are they, the things that got suggested, are they things that people would have failed an assessment on?
Based on the first
visit, cost benefit thing of we can always find things that people could be doing better, but if it's actually not averting a disaster, I'm just trying to.
I think there was one thing that stood out to me, where a team there was quite a major thing that they hadn't thought about, and it was around the impact of potentially building a digital service for what is essentially a very large-scale paper process, which is and what are the implications of introducing a digital service and involving people in that who are actually delivering that paper service in that service's development. And it was very much, have you thought about the impact of this? If something like this was introduced, what about those hundreds and many more people involved in delivering that service? What about jobs? What about the structure of the organisation? Have you even looked into that? And I don't think the service team actually had, which might seem remarkable on the outside, but then if you're in the team, you don't always think about these things. So they were really grateful that that was brought up by the assessor fairly early on.
So you kind of touched on this like really briefly when you said they might not end up being called assessors. But I wanted to ask about kind of the goal of this new approach to assessments. Around is the goal to sort of I imagine what the goal is to get more people through assessments, but while actually hitting the standard, so less people would fail, basically.
Yeah.
Does that then kind of change the role of the assessor and change kind of their goal from being like, I need to make sure that this person is doing the right thing, or I need to ask myself whether or not they're doing the right thing, to like what is the best thing they could be doing instead, and how much in the alpha is that have you kind of tested how to like brief assessors on that kind of slight mindset shift?
I think the brief is quite loose and deliberately so, but I think the ambition for the service and our vision is that we're moving away from something where it's as binary as you pass and fail on these points. Ultimately, the aim is not to pass the service assessment, it's to build better digital services. And I think that's the kind of aim. And in doing that, our hypotheses are around the view that if you visit the team regularly, you build trust with that team, you actually have a collaboration, you're going to be more open. You're not going to come in and try and tell a story every time you have to go through these kind of high risk points, which are like the current live service assessment model. And I think this is why we're not completely happy with assessor as the name, because they are assessing, but they're also coaching, they're guiding. One of the assessors we included works in the NHS in another role and was visiting an NHS team. They're not in the same organisation. Because he was inside of that organisation, he had links to people that are dealing with the same problems that he could signpost, which if we had a lead assessor from GDS, they just wouldn't know about. So I think it's a changing role, and we're still working out what that role should be and what we should call it. But I think the ambition is to make sure teams are doing the right thing, but do it in a different way that's less confrontational. It's whether you can do the two in one role, I think, is the other challenge for us. Can you make an objective assessment on the team if you're visiting them regularly, still have that objectivity, as well as kind of be their coach and sort of champion by assuring them, signposting them to relevant stuff. So there is a bit of a tension there, and that's what we're trying to play out at the moment. Adele.
Hello. I should have sat with my back to you. There's more people than I thought. It's my first time at Show and Tell, so feel free to be kind. So my name's Adele. I'm a senior tech advisor in Standards Assurance team, and what I do with my fellow tech advisors is basically controls, which is quite dull in one word. So it's my role to work with departments to understand what they're doing in terms of digital and technology, to be able to look at approving spend from Cabinet Office. We do that through lots of different ways, but essentially it's to adhere to the Tech Code of Practice and the service standard. So in doing that, in the financial year 14-15, the team managed to deliver savings of £391 million, which is quite impressive considering that controls were set up a couple of years before that, and the maturity of government is obviously developing over time. And equally, in the last financial year, 15-16, we have evidenced £339 million of savings. And again, considering that's another year on in terms of maturity, that's still pretty good. Those savings come from things like ensuring open competition, breaking up contracts, disaggregating services, changing capability, all those kinds of things. And that means we can save money and spend it on other useful things like hospitals and like schools, obviously. So we know what departments think of us. So we know that controls have served a purpose. They've been quite disruptive in necessarily stopping ineffective spend, or wrong spend perhaps. But we know there's lots of areas that we can work on. So in particular, we know that we encourage departments to join up their engagement with us. So we want to know what they're doing strategically and tactically when we're looking at spend controls and just generally their activity in digital and technology. But we don't necessarily do that for them. So we know in our engagement that sometimes we don't know that some teams are already talking to them. We don't know fully what the proposition might be internally to go to that department to talk about it, or maybe they've already done the thing that we might advise. We've heard that GDS is seen as being very willing to listen, to have lots of conversations, but departments are probably doing that on several different levels, several different people, several different times about the same thing, and that's not very effective. We also know that departments want a clearer understanding of who they can speak to in GDS. So there are lots of useful component parts, but how do we make that joined up for those departments to ensure that they're doing the right thing and that we can be constructive in our advice and how we manage those spend controls. So how are we going to adapt to that? So one thing we're doing in the immediate team is working with the consulting technical architects. So when I look at a request for spend that comes in, hopefully I've got some background and context to what that activity is to be able to have some informed idea of what's happening. From a technology perspective, I don't really consider myself a technologist, so I use the expertise of Rob Hetrick, for example, and John Stradwick to take a deeper dive into the technology of that particular request so that I can with confidence say, yes, this is effective use of taxpayer money. We also work with our service assessment manager colleagues on the direct team to feed in that view from the digital services when they're asking for their spend request as well. But there's the wider GDS as well. So Common Technology Services is obviously ramping up. There's lots of expertise there that can really provide a view into some of the activity of the departments and also what we as a unit can offer for those cross-government component parts. So effectively, we should be able to do a really good job as long as we've got the right equipment. So that's joining up, making sure that our engagement with the departments is unified, making sure that we're using the right expertise in the right way, making sure that we have one voice as GDS out to those departments. One of the ways we're going to be looking at that is a change to the controls process, where we're looking at a pipeline of activity from the department so we can be more proactive than reactive. But I'm sure we can go into more detail on that in a future show and tell. That was a whistle-stop tour. Any questions? I don't know if that's good or bad.
Just on the joining up with CTS stuff. Who have you been talking to about that?
Everyone, it feels. So I think we're trying to work out. We're trying to work out the sort of key contacts per department because CTS has an engagement model established and there's various kind of levels of activity going on, different levels of start points, and it might be advice and guidance on rolling out patterns, or it might be more specific strategic involvement in exiting a contract, for example. So I think it depends on the department, it depends on the engagement, and it depends on what they're trying to do. So I think it's a really key action to try and pull all that together so we can be really effective in how we do that, because joining it together is so much more powerful than speaking separately.
Yeah. So you don't have a specific person within.
Well, Victoria Ford as engagement lead across CTS is kind of the key funnel point at the moment. And so I work primarily with the Ministry of Justice, so I've got some specific contacts for specific activity. And I pester them if I've got questions about other stuff, just to be able to make sure we're not covering the same ground or joining up if some expertise is needed that hasn't been fed in. So it's a bit ad hoc at the moment, but we're trying to join it all together.
Thanks to Chris and Adele.